Hello class! In this lecture slideshow, we will cover sociological theories of crime. These include social bonding or social control theories of crime, social learning and cultural theories of crime, as well as conflict, critical, and radical theories of crime, and then finally feminist theories of crime, which the last couple there, the radical or criminal and the feminist theories of crime, are more so theories of lawmaking than they are criminal behavior. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. In discussing social control theories of crime, we ought to begin with the Enlightenment philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who in the 17th century wrote about what he called the Leviathan. And this was his idea that men must be kept in awe by a Leviathan, which was short for basically law and order, or else life will be, as he said, poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And based on the declines of human violence over time, with the installation of law and order, it does seem to be the case that Hobbes was on to something. Moving on to the 18th century, we have the intellectual founder of secular conservatism, which is Edmund Burke, who wrote on Thoughts on the Cause of Present Discontents in 1770 that, among many other things, one of his famous quotes is that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Again, we see a similar theme with Burke as we did with Hobbes, that evil or criminality is the default setting of human beings, and that something else needs to happen in order to prevent that kind of chaos to reign supreme. Now getting into the 20th century, fast forwarding a bit, there were other people who talked about ideas related to social control prior to Travis Hershey, but Travis Hershey is probably one of the more famous criminologists because what he did was, while he agreed in large part with Hobbes that law and order is of course necessary to keep chaos at bay, it's not a sufficient explanation of why some individuals are more involved in criminal behavior than others. That in addition to law and order, what you need are these kind of social bonds or interpersonal relationships that make people think twice about acting on their impulses. His book in 1969 was somewhat ironically called The Causes of Delinquency, but according to Hershey and this whole line of thinking, it's really not crime that needs to be explained. Crime comes naturally. It's civility that needs to be explained. And he thought that it could be explained by looking at variations in elements of the social bond. And so if you look over on the right-hand side, you see the social bond, the elements of it being defined as attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. And attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief all have their respective definitions. And so without these things, we can expect people to be more criminal than if they do have these things. That these social bonds prevent us from acting on our impulses and acting in a way that's predatory or just extremely selfish. The latest major addition to this whole line of thinking of social control, social bonding theory would have to be Robert Sampson and John Lobb and their age-graded theory of informal social control that was first discussed in 1990 in an article in American Sociological Review. And so the informal social control reminds us that it's not just about law and order. And they added to what Hershey was talking about by showing that you need to have, in addition to whatever is going on in childhood and adolescence to keep youngsters from acting on their worst impulses, you need the same process to continue into adulthood. And they talked about adult bonds to institutions like marriage, employment, and military service, which in turn help to explain variations in criminal desistance. That is, why people stop offending in adulthood. If you look at the chart over on the right, which is based on data that they supplemented with some earlier data that was collected by the Glucks, which were a team of researchers that looked at delinquent boys around the World War II period and followed them for several years. And then they followed them up later again when they were much older, looked at poured over their arrest records. That indeed, most people, pretty much all people, will desist from criminal offending at some point, even psychopaths. But there is a good deal of variation in this rate of desistance. And what they claim is that the salience of these adult bonds is what explains this variation. And so it's quite clear, at least with young men who marry, get a decent job and or are involved in military service, they are much more likely to walk the line, as Johnny Cash said, than are men who are sort of free to deviate, free to be criminal. And so this is the whole line of thinking about social control theory, which is quite a bit different from social learning or social cultural theories of crime, which do not have this kind of what some people call a tragic view of human nature. So social control theory, social bonding theory is seen as endorsing this kind of tragic view of human nature. As tragic as it may be, it is backed up by tremendous amounts of empirical support, love it or hate it.
Before getting to the early subcultural theories of crime, we have to start off by talking about social learning concepts within criminology. And here we have Ed Sutherland's differential association theory. And Sutherland's idea was that crime, like other behaviors, is learned via associations, and that crime reflects an excess of definitions favorable to the violation of law, and that not any old association is going to produce criminal outcomes. The influence of particular associations varies in several dimensions. The first is what he called priority. And this is basically what you learn first is what's going to have a greater impact versus what is learned later. So if early on in your childhood you learn that aggression is a way to resolve conflict, then you are more likely going to be a violent person than if aggressive violent behavior is something you encounter not until your adolescence. Second, intensity. That's about the emotional importance of the association. So mom is going to have more of an impact on you than, say, teachers. Third, duration, the length of the association, how long you are in contact with a particular group of people is going to matter. And then finally, frequency, how regular the contact. In the scene below from the great movie Goodfellas, it shows a young Henry Hill who has, over time during his early adolescent years, more frequent contact with gangsters than he does his own family. And this causes lots of problems for him, but he ends up becoming a major mobster himself. Actually, the movie Goodfellas is based on a true story, and Henry Hill was a real person. I'm sure most of you have probably seen Goodfellas, but if you have not, you'll want to. Moving then into subcultural, at least the early subcultural theories of crime, we have Miller's focal concerns of the lower classes. Miller's idea was that there are different set of values associated with the poor compared to the middle or upper classes. And he had a whole list of them. One is trouble, the idea that trouble is almost inevitable, and it's a kind of a rite of passage, that you're eventually going to get in trouble. It's just something that you need to learn how to deal with. Second is toughness, particularly physical toughness, being able to show strength in the face of adversity. Third is smartness, and not necessarily traditional academic smartness. We're talking about cunning and stealth, the ability to outsmart your enemies. Third, or fourth, I should say, is excitement and thrills, being down for whatever. There is also fate, the idea that you have an external locus of control, that there's really there's nothing that you can do to change what your fate is. That if you're doomed to be a failure, then you're going to be a failure. If you're going to be a winner, you're going to be a winner. It's just fate, and that any attempt to change this is just folly. And finally, autonomy, that no one, especially in positions of authority, can tell you what to do. That you are your own master, which is kind of at odds with the idea of fate, but nonetheless, this is what Miller thought was driving the higher rates of delinquency among the lower classes, as they used to be called, the poor, as we might call them today. David Matza in 1964 contended with some of his contemporaries by saying there's really no such thing as a criminal subculture, that what people do is they drift in and out of crime. And in the book, the authors have a subtitle called Getting the Drift. And this is the idea that crime is really not a way of life. There's not a separate set of values or beliefs that criminals carry around in their heads, that people drift in and out of criminal activity, and that crime is not really something particularly special. It has no special meaning even for people who are chronic offenders. That if you look at the patterning of crime over the life course, it does seem to follow more of a zigzag pattern than it does a hardcore criminal lifestyle, as some may describe. And so drift is this idea that people, even those people who are in and out of jail, it seems like every other month, that they aren't really part of a criminal subculture, that there really is no such thing. And this idea is based on an earlier theory that involved Matza and his colleague Sykes, known as techniques of neutralization, that people who are involved in criminal activity will go to great lengths to try to neutralize their bad behavior. And they had several different kinds of techniques of neutralization that criminals learn to try to excuse their bad behavior. One is denial of responsibility, basically saying, well, it's not my fault. There's the denial of injury. If you do something, you can say, for example, well, they have insurance, so that will cover it. So really no harm, no foul kind of idea. There's the denial of victim, the idea, well, he deserved it, and that's good enough as an excuse to neutralize any internal guilt I might be feeling. There's the condemnation of the condemners, that judges, police officers, any agents of the law, that they're corrupt, and so whatever sort of penalty you're facing is illegitimate. And finally, appeal to higher loyalties, that you're doing it for your crew, for your gangsters, for people that are part of your inner circle of criminals. You're following orders, and you can see this again in the movie Goodfellas, that people are doing things for the sake of loyalty to the group. And so techniques of neutralization, as you can probably tell, are not limited to people who are involved in criminal behavior. We all do this as a way to try to neutralize our own guilty feelings. And it certainly, though, can be seen in movies with mobsters like Goodfellas. Later subcultural theories became increasingly focused on violence, particularly violence in urban areas and among blacks. And much has been written about the subculture of violence. And perhaps one of the most popular books on the subject is a book by Elijah Anderson called Code of the Streets. And in it, if you have not read this book, you should. It's very well written, and it's not a really technical academic type book. It's a book meant for a general audience, but he goes through the economic and social explanations as to why there would be such a thing called a subculture of violence. People debate over whether or not a real subculture of violence exists, just like if there's a real subculture of crime. But nonetheless, Anderson's explanation for this is very much grounded in recent economic events going back just a few decades within the United States. That what you have where there is high homicide rates, you tend to have extremely economically distressed or poor communities that are also highly segregated, highly racially segregated. And it's not as if ghettos popped out of nowhere, that this was a result of deindustrialization. So you have areas in Detroit, areas in New Jersey, such as Camden, New Jersey, where you had once a lively urban area where a lot of jobs were available. These jobs during the 1970s and 80s started becoming offshored, moved over to China and Mexico, and even more so automation replaced them, so being replaced by robots and software. And this pulled the rug out from under a lot of working class families. And so a lot of young men, the younger generation, the boys coming up in the 70s, 80s, really had no examples of men in conventional jobs to follow along. And so what they did was did what any young boy would do and resort to more aggressive behavior as a way to seek status. It's part of what Anderson calls the code of the streets. And what you had along with this was the breakdown of the two-parent family at a loss of the middle class and intact two-parent family homes in these urban areas. And after all that, what you get is what Anderson calls an oppositional subculture. So oppositional in the sense that you don't necessarily want to work with the police. If there is a serious violent crime, you certainly don't talk to the police because they're not on your side. You're in opposition to that. But also there is something called self-help justice. This is the idea that you need to be the judge, jury, and executioner sometimes because certainly the law is not reliable. So you would need to take the law into your own hands, vigilante justice, as well as a big emphasis on personal honor, that your status, respect, because you don't have anything else. You don't have a lot of money or status in any other conventional way, any other conventional form of status. So your personal honor is paramount. And then physical toughness. So kind of hearkening back to Walter Miller's idea that among the poor, especially adolescent and young males, that showing physical toughness is very important. It's all a part of your honor, maintaining your own status in that environment. Labeling theory is a theory that became popular during the 1960s and 70s. It was this idea that what we think of as deviant or acceptable is in a large part socially constructed. So sociologists began pointing out that, well, there are behaviors that are equally destructive, but they're not seen as deviant or certainly not considered criminal by the law. So alcohol use versus drug use, for example, pornography versus prostitution, war versus murder, and we can come up with lots of other categories most likely where one is roughly equivalent to the other, but because of the way that it's defined under law, the one is illegal while the other is perfectly legal. And so labels get applied to behaviors, making them either deviant or illegal or acceptable and legitimate. So that's the first thing to recognize with labeling theory. Labeling theory can also have a real impact on how people just perceive behavior. One of the more shocking examples, perhaps you've heard of this before, is Rosenhan's experiment called Being Sane in Insane Places. And you want to follow the link. What Rosenhan did was he was very skeptical of psychiatrists' ability to properly identify people with mental disorders. He thought that if he were to send actors in to mental asylums, that all they would have to do was initially fake some mental symptoms, and then if they would act normal while they were in the asylum, that they would continue to be labeled or perceived as being insane, even though they're acting perfectly sane. And that is exactly what happened. And so you want to follow that link to get a sense of what happened in that story. Several movie scenes from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest nicely exemplifies labeling theory as well, with the characters in this movie. One of the main characters is Jack Nicholson's character, who fakes mental illness to get out of his prison and gets placed in a mental institution. But because he becomes labeled as mentally ill, very awful things happen to him. In the first scene, he realizes that one of the characters in the movie, Chief, is faking mental illness himself just to avoid being in prison. Jack Nicholson's character ends up receiving electroshock therapy, which is something they did in the 1960s and 70s and before that to try to keep people from acting on psychotic impulses, they thought. And finally, Jack Nicholson's character is lobotomized, which is something they used to do. And this is because he was labeled as someone who was acting insane, and the consequences of which is that he was treated as a psychotic person who underwent extreme surgery to try to cure him of his worst impulses. And so you want to follow those scenes. Labeling theory is also associated with the ideas of primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is what is done initially to get a label applied to someone. So you break the law, you go to prison, and then you are labeled as a criminal because you are a criminal. But the bad part about it is you internalize that criminal label, and you think of yourself then, your person, as being a criminal. But the act, it's not just that the act was criminal, you yourself are now a criminal. And so then secondary deviance is this idea that you begin to act upon that label, and that the label becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as they say, that you become the monster who society said you were always going to become. And this is nicely exemplified by the Stanford prison experiment. There was a psychologist named Zimbardo who took college students from Stanford University and had them participate as either prison guards or prisoners. And the experiment had to be stopped prematurely because the guards began to internalize their labels and began to abuse the other students who were acting as prisoners, and the prisoners themselves became confused about who they were and started to internalize the label as being prisoners. And so this is an experiment that could no longer be done today because of ethics rules, but it shows the power of the label and how when people are labeled, it does tend to go to their heads. It can anyway. And so we have to be careful about institutionalizing people if there's not any other way to punish them or to treat them. Known as conflict theory or critical criminology, also sometimes referred as radical criminology, this brand of criminology is not so much a theory of human behavior as most mainstream criminology is. It's more so a theory of law and government, the way it operates to favor the rich and the powerful. And there are several principles that we're going to highlight here to make sense of this radical perspective on crime. The first of which is that government and laws exist to favor the wealthy and the powerful. Now, this, of course, is most famously associated with Karl Marx, but more recently, the criminologists Quinney and Chambliss have added their chapters to this narrative. An example that makes this perspective seem perhaps less radical than what it does on the surface comes directly from criminal justice, and that is the fact that in the United States, And not too many other places have this system. It's one in which we have a pay to avoid jail system. And so if you are offered bail and you can pay it, then you can avoid going to jail. Or if you can't pay the bail, then you can pay a bail as bondsman. But sometimes you can't even do that. Well, some might find that to favor the people who happen to have money. And so if you follow this link, there is a documentary done by the news program Vice that highlights some of the injustices inherent in the system, because of course it is the poor who are more likely than to have to stay in jail to await their day in court. And there are several disadvantages to this, one of which is you cannot prepare a legal defense as easily if you're sitting in a jail cell. Secondly is that you're going to lose your job if you're sitting in jail. And thirdly, it's going to disrupt a lot of other social relationships while you're in jail, which can make it more problematic than for you to defend yourself in court, because there might not be many witnesses coming forward to vouch for you. Okay, so that's one example that comes directly from conflict theory. Another example that's slightly less related to criminal justice is the difference between the bank bailouts and welfare frauds. So most recently in 2007, 2008, if you recall, the federal government bailed out a lot of major banks because they were going broke, because they were allowing investors on Wall Street to engage in all kinds of nefarious practices. That if the average Joe or Jane did this, we would call them welfare frauds or some type of financial fraud, and we would most likely go to jail for doing it. And so this is all kind of complicated stuff, and it is exemplified in the movie The Big Short, which is a great movie. You have not seen that. There's a link here that is explaining some of these dubious practices that were going on Wall Street, all legal, by the way. And that's another important point made by critical criminologists, is that much of the financial crimes that go on that we all have to pay for in the end are actually, by the letter of law, legal while they're happening. It takes some disaster like the 2007-2008 recession before we recognize, hey, maybe this wasn't a good idea that we're allowing all these nefarious practices to go on Wall Street. So much worse comparatively to that of the average welfare fraud, who is most likely a poor person. Third example is the civilian deaths in war. If we want to think of these in relationship to civilian deaths in drive-by shootings, or that is people who are not the intended targets, but people who happen to get shot anyway. And so there are, of course, lots of innocent or civilian deaths that go on in war. And this strikes a moral chord with a lot of people. The political critic and linguist Noam Chomsky has a clip here. He's speaking to a commentator on if the Nuremberg principles were enforced. These are principles that were set up after World War II, then all U.S. presidents since World War II could be indicted under international law. And so that's a point worth considering. There is also a couple clips here from the movie Apocalypse Now, which is a Vietnam movie, and it shows how the line between murder and the kind of killing that goes on in war can be blurred. And so if you follow the first clip, we have an actor that is being portrayed as someone working under the direction of the CIA to go kill Colonel Kurtz, who is the major antagonist of the movie, and he is apparently directing a group of rebels without the okay of the brass to go and kill other people in Cambodia. And so that would be illegal under general conditions, but because it's being done by the CIA, then there's plausible deniability there, so they can get away with those sort of things. not too far from the reality of some of the operations that were overseen by the CIA. The second scene is with Colonel Kilgore and his operation where they're playing the soundtrack from Flight of the Valkyries and shooting down communist resistance within Vietnam, and of course killing civilians in the process, and just kind of making light of it. So these are all things that are not particularly special to Vietnam, although the Vietnam War is thought of as a war that exemplifies these kind of horrors, but it's certainly something that goes on in warfare where murder is blurred with the killing of enemy combatants. And so this is another example that conflict theorists would point to say that the only reason that we don't consider this murder is because the government has defined it not as being murder. Another major premise or principle of conflict theory is that crime really is a class struggle, a conflict between the powerful and the powerless. And they point to criminal behavior as being a political statement sometimes. And this is what we see with protests. They point out protests that sometimes end up turning violent, but the protests, the critical theorists argue, are messages that the system is unjust and needs to be fixed. The first link, it goes to recent protests in the 21st century that we should take note of. One of which probably is still in your mind is the Ferguson protests that happened after the shooting of the miner Michael Brown. And then the second link is to a scene from the movie Argo that won Best Picture a few years back. It's about the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s, which actually portrays events that did happen. And it's an example of a protest that did turn violent. But from the perspective of the Iranian protesters, they would say that the justice or the violence is justifiable because of U.S. intervention into their country, backing the Shah dictator, which many people in Iran did not like at the time. The third major principle behind the conflict theory is that there is a widespread criminalization of the defenseless. And so these are people who happen to have not as much money or power, that they are going to be penalized disproportionately. One of the most famous examples of this is the crack cocaine sentencing disparities, where for the longest time, at least at the federal level, sometimes adopted by states, that you would have to carry 100 times the amount of cocaine to get the same sentence you would for crack. And because poor people are more likely to use the rocked up form, crack, than the powder form, then this, according to conflict theorists, is an example of the criminalization of the defenseless. Rich kids are more likely to snort cocaine than they are to smoke the rock. So there you go. More broadly so, are there examples of arrest disparities between blacks and whites for drug offenses? Despite that there are lower rates of drug use among blacks, their arrest rates, that is, their arrest rates for blacks, are considerably higher than they are for whites. Now, some would argue this is just a byproduct of the higher rates of violence within majority black communities, but others would point to the fact that this does not excuse the reality that there are so many younger black people being locked up for petty drug offenses and not enough enforcing of laws related to violence. Now, there is an interesting conspiratorial backdrop to some of this, and some of conflict or critical criminology has been accused of being conspiratorial, and for good reason, because conspiracies are baked right into the theorizing. Probably the most famous one relates to the Iran-Contra affair. In the 1980s, there was an effort to try to free hostages in Iran by selling them weapons. The money that was used, or the money that was gained from that sale, some of it was funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua by Oliver North under the direction of the then President Ronald Reagan. The Contras were fighting the communist group, the Sandinistas. The Contras also happened to fund their operations to kill the communists, who, by the way, we wanted the communists dead. They would fund their operations by selling drugs. And the conspiracy theory is backed up by various people, but that some of these drugs were being allowed to pass over the US-Mexican border and then seeping into primarily black communities. And the link gives you a quick rundown of the Iran-Contra affair. And then the second link to the movie Boys in the Hood, by the way, if you haven't seen Boys in the Hood, it's a great movie. It has an actor talking about how there are drugs coming into their communities, but there's no possible way that the people in that community could be responsible for the drugs getting in there, that the people on the outside of the community want them to kill themselves, and so these drugs are allowed to be brought in. And you will hear this conspiracy theory from particularly older people living in primarily black communities that believe that the US government wants them to kill themselves with drugs. And so there's, with any conspiracy theory like that, there tends to be a small nugget of truth. Now, of course, a lot of the drugs that are getting into poor and primarily black communities are not, it's not an effort by the CIA to see that black people undermine their own well-being. It just happens to be true, though, that the Contras were allowed to sell drugs, and some of those drugs probably did cross over the US border, but at the time, the government turned its head because they were more interested in killing communists than they were keeping drugs from crossing the US border. And so you got to take all this with a grain of salt, but there is a nugget of truth to this conspiracy theory. Feminist criminology, similar to conflict theory, is not so much a theory of human behavior as it is an attempt to highlight the fact that women, girls, have been left out of the study of crime for most of criminology's history. There have been efforts started really in the late 70s, 1980s to try to bring more women into the fold, and that we will discuss these efforts with several major observations, one of which is that women have been neglected from the study of crime. This has been pointed out by the criminologist Kathleen Daly and Meta Chesney-Lynn, that the majority of crime theories and data are focused on males. Now, at first glance, this makes complete sense because the majority of crimes are committed by males. But there are certain risk factors that seem to have more of an effect on women than they do on men. One of which is sexual abuse. So sexual abuse generally is a risk factor for later criminal offending, but the effect seems to be much more pronounced among girls. Girls are more likely than boys to experience sexual abuse, as the graphic on the right shows. More so, though, is the fact that sexual abuse has a more consistent effect on girls offending. So sexual abuse is a more common feature among females who are repeat offenders or chronic offenders. So this is important to acknowledge when we're trying to come up with theories of crime, that it may not be good enough just to have general crime theories and then add women and stir, that you might need theories that are more gender specific because certain risk factors are more of an issue for girls than they are for boys. Second major point that feminist criminologists point out is that research on crime against women, so sexual assault and domestic violence in particular, have been neglected from the history of criminology for the most part. It didn't start until again, the 1970s and 1980s, after the second wave of feminism, that criminologists started taking seriously the issues of domestic violence, which was thought to be more of a private issue because it wasn't crime in the streets, it was a crime in the home, and that was considered more of a private, a family issue, as well as sexual assault. That this is now very much a major object of study within criminology, but it hasn't always been the case. And this is also important to study when it comes to female crime, because female violence is usually directed at males who are often intimate partners or family members, which is not so much the case for male offenders. Males, of course, will also offend family members and intimate partners, but males are not as specific as female offenders are. And this has been exemplified in popular movies such as Thelma and Louise. There is a scene here quite disturbing of an attempted rape, and then one of the characters, I forget which one it is, Thelma or Louise, shoots the rapist. And so this is an example of the kind of violence that is more closely associated with women than it is men, killing of intimate partners, romantic partners. Another observation when we take women into consideration studying crime is that drug use often precedes female criminal involvement, including prostitution. This is not the case for boys. When you look at boys' life course of crime, usually what you find is that delinquency, non-drug related criminal behavior starts first and then the drug use comes later. With women, it's the other way around. Usually the drug use starts first and then the non-drug related crime happens after the fact. And so this is closely related to the crime of prostitution, crime in the United States. A lot of other places, most places outside the United States, in fact, prostitution is legal, or at least decriminalized. But within the United States, it is criminalized, which has its own consequences and an issue for feminists. Some are for still supporting the prohibition of prostitution. Others are very much against it. But a couple movies here that have prostitution as a theme. One is Leaving Las Vegas, and then there is a link here with a series of scenes from that movie with the actor Nicolas Cage and the other actor Elizabeth Shue, who plays a prostitute in it. And oftentimes when you have women who are prostitutes forming relationships with men, the relationship can be abusive, as it is in Leaving Las Vegas, where he's an alcoholic and she is trying to form a romantic relationship with him. And in the movie Requiem for a Dream, even darker than Leaving Las Vegas, the actress in this movie, I'm blanking on her name right now, but she is drawn into prostitution because of her drug use. And that is a common theme that you see in the research on prostitution. Thirdly, criminal justice system has neglected the needs of women. It is another issue highlighted by feminist criminologists, that we know that over 90% of incarcerated women have young dependent children, where, of course, many men in jails and prison also have young children, but they are not necessarily the primary caregivers of these children. For the women, however, that are locked up, most definitely they are the primary caregivers. And so this makes it all the more salient of an issue for women who are locked up, that a lot of times they have young children at home that were depending on mom for all their basic needs, and now she is in jail and she is in prison. So that's an issue. Also, the majority of incarcerated women lived previously with an abusive partner and will return to an abusive partner upon release. And so this is another complicating factor that's not quite the same for men, that you have women who are in these abusive relationships. Part of the reason why they may have gone to prison is because of the abusive relationship, and they'll return to that abusive relationship after they get out of prison, which is, of course, a risk for recidivism, to be with a partner who is abusive. And then finally, criminal justice has been, for the longest time, a male-dominated profession. And this is nicely exemplified in the movie Silence of the Lambs. While Silence of the Lambs is well known for the interaction between the actress Jodie Foster and Hannibal Lecter, that there is also a couple scenes in this movie that shows the male-dominated nature of the criminal justice system. And if you click on this link, it has Jodie Foster's character being surrounded by male sheriffs and sheriff's deputies, all kind of looking at her like, what are you even doing here? Jodie Foster happens to be in training for the FBI, so she's kind of like outranking them, and they definitely don't like that. But it's interesting, and it kind of highlights the tension there of women getting involved in law enforcement, how they're seen as kind of outsiders.